All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, May 16th, 1997, in the East Room of the White House, President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology for the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. This apology was, as even Clinton would concede, too little and far too late. But nevertheless, it was the government formally owning up for its role in running what was eventually a 40-year study to determine the effect of untreated syphilis in black men. The men in the study, which started in the early 1930s, were never told that they had syphilis. They were told that they had, quote, bad blood, and many were denied treatment to tragic consequences. The Tuskegee study is a notorious and shameful chapter in American medical and governmental history. Here to discuss it and the Clinton apology and the legacy of all of it are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So we have said the words Tuskegee and then something after it a number of times on this podcast. We've talked about the Tuskegee Institute, which is now called the university. We've talked about the Tuskegee Airmen. I think we have made references to the Tuskegee experiments. So, let's start at the very basic level, because I think I get confused and I think people get confused. How are these related? What are all these things? Everything seemed to have happened in Tuskegee. Maybe we should just give a little 101 of what's happening in Tuskegee.
Sure. So there's Tuskegee, the town. That's the name of the town in Alabama. There's also the university or the school, which is initially called Tuskegee Institute. And the Tuskegee Airmen were trained in Tuskegee, Alabama, which is why they're called the Tuskegee Airmen. But some of these blend together, and then some of them are completely separate. But sometimes it's often hard to tell who is influencing who or collaborating with who. But for the most part, we should know that when we talk about Tuskegee, we're usually talking about either the HBCU or the town itself.
Yeah.
And in this case, we're talking about the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male, which has often just been called the Tuskegee syphilis study or the Tuskegee study. And this took place at the Tuskegee Institute, but it was primarily run by the U.S. Public Health Service. And we can get into all of the details of the study.
Yeah, well, let's get into the details. But I do think this question of the relationship between the institute itself, in almost every context, we talk about it as what an amazing force for uplift and progress. And then there's this tricky and confusing and complicated question of their role in this notorious, awful study. And I'll just say, even in prepping for this, we kind of ended up twisting ourselves a little into knots, trying to figure out exactly what the role is. But as best we understand it, or as best we can kind of characterize our difficulty understanding it, where do we stand in terms of the relationship between the university and this study?
It's complicated. I think that there are definitely people who work for the university who have a role with the Tuskegee experiment. But that does not at all mean that the institute itself is sponsoring what is taking place. It doesn't even necessarily mean that they're aware that this experiment is taking place. So people are sometimes associated with the university, and so the university, I think, gets connected to the experiment, but not necessarily because they were directly having a hand in the experiment itself.
Right. And even for the people that were at Tuskegee Institute and were participating in the experiment, they might not have known the full scope of the experiment and the kinds of treatment that were being withheld. And, that the ultimate goal, as we'll talk about, was to allow these men with syphilis to go through the entire range of the disease until they died. And it's just not clear that everyone who participated in carrying out the study understood that that's what was happening.
Yeah. One of the little tidbit about the relationship between the school and this study, it's actually Robert Russa Moton, who was the person who the school at which there was the strike in Virginia that led to Brown v. Board that we did an episode about ago. That he was named after Moton. Moton was the president of the Tuskegee Institute when all of this was going down.
That's amazing.
So he sort of wends his way through a lot of our stories here, and I'm sure he wrestled with that sort of legacy as well. Yeah.
And it's also important to note that these were grown men. So these were not Tuskegee students. These were not college students who were part of this experiment. These were largely agricultural, poor Black farmers that lived in and around Tuskegee and that were basically, facing syphilis and not being treated for their disease.
As long as we're in our debunking phase, we should also note that it wasn't the U.S. officials who gave these men syphilis, that they had contracted syphilis and then they had come to participate in this experiment because the health service had put up all of these flyers saying, come get your blood tested, come get tested for bad blood, bring your family, and then promise to help them.
Yeah. So just to tie a bow, or at least, on the kind of relationship here, the painting the picture. I mean, in my head, I imagine there's a study in town. As you said, the participants are not students in this university. But when in a town like this, when you have a big research university, where are going to be the facilities in which to conduct the study? Where is some of the funding going to go? It's obviously going to tie into the university. But I think, as we've been pointing out, it can be murky and people cannot know exactly what's up. We just re-aired that episode about MK Ultra and pointed out in there that so many of these experiments were government funded. People didn't even know where the money was coming from, didn't even really know what was going on. But obviously the facilities were being used, the infrastructure was being used. So I think that's the kind of picture to paint here. Okay. We started talking a little bit about the experiments itself. Niki, you made a reference to these signs that start going up in the fall of 1932 around Macon County, Alabama. I want to read the signs, but they basically say, free blood test, free treatment by county health department and government doctors. You may feel well and still have bad blood. Come and bring all your family. Knowing where this story ends up, that's just a heartbreaking thing to think about, that sign. But what is that sign getting at? How does this experiment first go into motion?
I mean, it's really luring people, mostly poor people, who don't have great health care or access to great health care to come and be a part of what is really an experiment. And I feel like an experiment is kind of a euphemism because they know exactly what they're doing. They know that by the early 1840s, they have developed a cure for syphilis. Penicillin would cure syphilis as an antibiotic. And they're intentionally keeping them from being cured, from receiving any kind of treatment. They're also performing all kinds of horrific medical experimentation on them. Some of these men are getting spinal taps. They're having their blood drawn. They're having, painful procedures done on them, all in the name of science, in the name of finding a cure for them. And there was never an intent to cure them. In a lot of instances, in fact, perhaps all instances, there were attempts to actively keep people from getting better and from getting the medication that they needed.
And it wasn't just that the medication was being withheld, but the knowledge of the disease itself. Jody, the sign you read talked about bad blood, and that's what government doctors told these men that they had. They didn't tell them they had syphilis. They didn't tell them it was a sexually transmitted disease. And so even if they had come across the news that syphilis had this treatment in penicillin, they didn't know they had syphilis. And so they were also then transmitting the disease to their partners. Women who then contracted the disease were transmitting it to their children. So there was this, not epidemics maybe not the right word, but this disease was spreading because doctors were withholding their knowledge about it.
Yeah. Well, we talk about the 30s and 40s of when this is starting up, and to your point, it's a generational thing. People die by the 70s, but then 40 wives are infected, 19 children contracted disease at birth as a result of this. So yes, it's not just like there was a study going on. It was also this generational impact. So I think epidemic, is probably, I don't know, that might be the right word. But you mentioned penicillin comes along. So it's in the mid-40s, not long after this starts, that penicillin is a standard cure for syphilis at this point. And of course, the sort of big medical breach at the heart of all of this is that is withheld from the participants in this study.
Yeah, and one of the aspects of this story that is so disturbing, and there are a lot of disturbing aspects, is there was a woman by the name of Eunice Rivers who was responsible for bringing these Black men to get their quote-unquote care. And she would take them, pick them up, take them to visit the Institute's doctors. But she would also follow them to make sure that they weren't going to see like a private doctor, to make sure that they weren't going to get a second opinion, if you will. And so that policing of these men's behaviors and their outcomes is also really disturbing to see that this woman would be, so complicit in making sure that they stayed sick.
Making sure that they stayed sick and untreated because they wanted to chart the course of this disease. And so you have people who are in this experiment who go blind from syphilis. Once it reaches its tertiary stage, it affects the brain. So people are having mental illnesses associated with it. And ultimately, people die from it. And kind of grotesquely, one of the things that the doctors conducting the study do is, in order to ensure that they get to autopsy the body, they promise to cover the burial. Up to $50 to cover the casket and grave. So it is a series of manipulations, not even until they die, even after their deaths.
Yeah.
And that $50 was like, we'll take care of the burial. And then what that actually allows us to do is do an autopsy on this body to, quote unquote, conclude the study. Yes.
And for poor families that can't afford caskets, that can't afford to bury their loved ones, there's no generational wealth being handed down. So oftentimes when Black people die, people get in huge amounts of debt trying to bury their loved one. And so this economic incentive seems like a good deal, but unknowingly that you are literally sending your loved one to an early grave.
Yeah. We'll talk about how this comes out and it gets exposed, and then there's the hearings and the apology, which is the moment we're marking here. But, in the wake of this, we sort of come to learn that the community is this interesting mix of people recognize that there's a tragedy happening around them. But I think it's more than anything, it's a testament to the sort of power of the faith in government, and then when the government is conducting a study, and maybe the local university is part of the study as well, or has the patina of being part of it, people really put their faith in that.
And in medicine, in doctors.
Exactly.
I mean, this is the same era as the Milgram experiments, which are flawed, but this idea that you trust a person in a white coat.
Yeah. But yes, I completely agree. But, moreover, just to sort of state the obvious here, but it's like, think about those MK Ultra experiments or even the Milgram experiments. Those are like an experiment in which someone you trust in a white coat is having you do something that feels very outside the norms and is pushing the limit. And even there, people don't push back. Here, syphilis was a disease that was ravaging, that was part of this community that was killing people. And so it's understandable that no one would have really said, wait, there's something fishy here, because it was just about letting a disease that was already there continue to run wild. So in terms of how this gets exposed, it's really not until the mid to late 60s. This is where we should introduce someone by the name of Peter Buxton. And he is, a whistleblower and a real kind of hero in all of this.
Yeah, he basically says, listen, I'm looking at all of this. This is not right. This is suspicious. And then starts to basically sound the alarm and say, we need to do something about this. This is unethical. These men aren't aware of what's going on. And furthermore, these men can and should be treated and are being withheld treatment. And so When he starts to sound the alarm and realizes that he's getting pushback and that people are trying to dismiss him and want to suppress the story, that's when he goes to the press and says, all right, the press will let this become public. And then when it does, it creates all of this public outrage. And that's what effectively shuts the study down, public outrage and knowledge about what's taking place.
Fascinating that this is happening in 1972, because we've just talked for the last week about the Church Committee and the way that it was exposing all of these things that the government was doing that was harming American citizens. And here you have the Tuskegee experiment, which is now being exposed as another thing that the government is doing that is harming people instead of helping them.
I just want to highlight the sort of role of the press here as well, and that it is an AP article, an AP journalist that really exposes this. And I think, I know we're coming off of this whole Church Committee thing, so my head's in the kind of like faith in government and the role of the press and how much press can serve as whistleblowers, but then also the sort of the press as an institution itself. But clearly this is all related to all of those big things we've been discussing. And, it is, again, also into the 70s and exactly this period. I think what we're painting a picture of is an era in the mid-70s of a sort of real questioning of government's role. There are hearings in July of 1974 and laws, and so we talk about the mid-70s as a period of like all these new transparency laws coming into place and all these other things. Congress signs the National Research Act into law and the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. They could have come up with a better, there's no acronym there. But
the
all of those, that comes into place as well, and so you get this sort of era of reforms as well, because people's faith is so shaken.
Yeah. And then, there's a civil rights attorney, Fred Gray, who basically files a class action on behalf of the men. This is 1973. And they get an out-of-court settlement of not a lot, about $10 million. But if you think about the fact that 600 people were involved in this study, if you were to divide 10 million up by 600 people, it's only about $16,000, which is not a lot. You have to also think of the fact that their wives were impacted, their children were impacted. So it's not just the people who were directly in the study. So this, to me, is not really the victory that it should feel like.
Mm-hmm. And then if you fast forward 20 years, that's when the National Medical Association, which is an organization of Black doctors, sort of the equivalent to the American Medical Association, comes forward and asks for an apology, in part because nobody had ever offered an apology, but also the Tuskegee experiment spreads real and understandable distrust of the medical profession among many Black Americans, because there's evidence that the U.S. government was using Black men as medical experiment subjects. And so part of the push for this apology is to try to begin to restore some faith in the system. And that can only start when the federal government acknowledges and apologizes for what it's done.
This is also tough because, this is not some sort of conspiracy that's cooked up by the right or something like that. This is a real, yes, this absolutely happened. And the apology is not just about saying, I'm sorry. It's also about acknowledging, yes, we did do this. The federal government harmed Black men intentionally, and their wives and their children intentionally for decades, withheld care, withheld cures, and then, and didn't compensate them either. So an apology is really the least of it, but getting them to acknowledge it is a huge part of saying, like, no, this was not a conspiracy.
Yeah. The ceremony at the White House that Clinton issues this apology, there are 8 survivors at that point. 5 of them are present, including one who estimates his age to be 110 years old at that point, Fred Simmons. But, really a remarkable moment. A couple thoughts, and then we'll wrap up on legacy here. I mean, obviously, around the COVID vaccine, we heard a conversation about deep distrust in the African-American community with regards to medicine and sort of the government telling you what to do or what not to do. Do we feel like there is a direct line there still?
Oh,
However many generations
absolutely.
later.
Absolutely, no question. I mean, I can't tell you how many of my Black family members and friends were like, oh, no, I'm not getting the vaccination because that's what the government's trying to administer, some sort of something. I'll say that it was a big push, I think, by Black doctors to really, say to their patients, hey, it's okay for you to take this drug. I know, for family members that got the vaccine, they told me that it was their Black medical providers that really helped them understand that it was okay to do it. And as a result, they got the vaccination. But that trust is such a huge part of people's decisions to get not just treatment for COVID, but also like early breast cancer screenings and early like colonoscopies and things that would prevent cancer or at least circumvent it earlier than it would normally happen if you sought no treatment.
Yeah. And I suppose there's a real lesson there just in general about kind of the power of needing to engage at the community level and that people listen to people in their community and that when you swoop in, I mean, not to equate COVID vaccines with the Tuskegee study, but, the idea that like a big government detached from a local community is going to swoop in and solve problems alone, I think is a through line here. And that really what needs to happen is you need to engage with the actual community that you're dealing with. And that goes for not just medical studies, that probably goes for every single part of government.
Yeah. I want to read the last line of the apology that Clinton gives where he says, we can't give you what you lost back. And then he says, what was done cannot be undone, but we can end the silence. We can stop turning our heads away. We can look at you in the eye and finally say, on the behalf of the American people, what the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry. And I wonder when like people hear that versus then and even now, like what is the response to that? Is that sufficient? I mean, it's an acknowledgement for sure, but it still stings. It still feels a little null and void after the fact that you're 110 years old and you're now getting an apology, but not payment, not compensation.
Well, I think that it's important to note that this is happening in an era of government apologies. And I think your question, Kellie, about what is the purpose and what is the impact is really important because Reagan gave an apology in the 1980s for Japanese internment. That came along with reparations as well. Clinton gives an apology right before this for the American coup in Hawaii that overthrew the Kingdom of Hawaii. And those things are acknowledgments and they're something, but they are limited. And Clinton does package this with a few other things, investment in Black doctors. They throw $200,000 at the Tuskegee Institute to start a bioethics lab. So there's something, but I agree with you. Like there's such generational damage there that it's hard to think that it's enough.
Right. I mean, any apology will fall short of the deep level of harm that we're talking about here. I mean, I will say we think so much about kind of apologies and non-apologies these days, especially, with like the whole social, and I think the classic, like, I'm sorry if you felt hurt apology or the like apology where someone doesn't actually say I'm sorry. And so, in whatever way I read this Clinton, and at least it is straightforward. It says we cannot stop turning our heads away. I want to be clear, what we did was shameful and I am sorry. So at the very least, in terms of like...
It's a real apology. I mean, if you read the whole thing, it's a legit real apology.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we will leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.